The snow came sideways through the night, a white curtain pulled by God's own hand, rattling shutters and whistling against the saloon's warped boards. Men gathered inside, loud and heavy with drink, yet the real cruelty was not kept to four walls. It spilled outside into the street where lantern light glowed against the storm, flickering across the figure they had tied upright to the post. Eliza Mayfield's head bent under the weight of shame. Her auburn hair, once her one vain possession, had been hacked away in tufts, clinging now to the snow like bloodless scalps. The laughter of settlers rang louder than the storm. "Too weak to hold her own," one spat, his knife still glinting from the cutting. "Best mark her so all can see." At her feet crouched her child, Lydia, no more than 4 years old. The girl's cheeks were flushed scarlet from the cold, wet trails of tears freezing against her skin. Her small arms tried to cover her mother's knees, as if her tiny frame could shield a grown woman from the jeers of men. "Please," she cried, voice breaking against the wind. "Don't hurt Mama. Please don't." The plea found no mercy. It was sport to them, the way cruelty often becomes when backed by a chorus of laughter and a keg of whiskey. They had decided Eliza was too fragile, too dependent, too much a burden on the wagon train that had turned into a settlement. Better to shame her than help her, for a marked woman makes others feel stronger. Sheriff Amos Greeley watched from the porch, thumbs hooked in his belt, his silence permission enough. Behind him, women whispered beneath shawls, Martha Greeley among them, her tongue sharp with judgment. "Hair gone or not, she'll cling to the first man who'll feed her. Pitiful thing. Best she learn her place." But not every watcher joined in. At the far edge of the light, where snow swallowed silhouettes, stood a figure tall as the pines and broad across the shoulders. Shirtless though the storm bit deep, his skin bore scars that shimmered faintly in the fireglow. Chaska, the Apache, silent as if carved from the night itself. His long hair streamed in the wind, black against the snow, his eyes steady upon the scene. Eliza did not yet see him. Her gaze was trapped low, on the child clinging to her skirts. The coarse rope bit into her wrists, her fingers turning blue. Every laugh burned like salt in wounds she carried within. The death of her husband on the trail, the weeks of hunger, the whispered doubts that she was fit to mother even one child. Now shorn and bound, she felt less a woman and more a spectacle, a creature stripped of dignity. Lydia's sobs rose higher as another man reached forward to tug the rope cruelly, jerking Eliza's frame. The girl threw herself against him, small fists beating against his leg. "Stop!" she screamed, with the ferocity only a child's pure heart can summon. The man shoved her aside, and she stumbled in the snow, her doll slipping from her grasp. It was then, crawling after the doll with shaking hands, that she lifted her eyes and saw him. Chaska, standing where the snow met lantern smoke. He did not move, did not speak, yet the storm itself seemed to bend around his stillness. Lydia's sobs caught into silence. She rose to her feet, her little chest heaving. Something in her, perhaps the last ember of hope not yet smothered, drove her small legs through the snow toward him. The men jeered again. "Go on, girl," begged the savage. "Maybe he'll scalp what's left of her head." Their laughter gusted like fire through tinder. Yet the child did not falter. She stumbled into the shadow of the giant, looking up through lashes wet with snow. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking in two. Her mittenless hands clasped together, as she looked into his eyes that seemed older than the storm. "Please marry her. Please save my mama." The world slowed then, as if the storm itself held its breath. Chaska's jaw flexed, his scars stark in the firelight. For the first time his gaze shifted, from the child at his knees to the woman tied and trembling by the post. Eliza's head lifted faintly, as if feeling his eyes upon her like a cloak draped against her naked shame. Sheriff Amos barked a laugh, uneasy. "Ain't no law says he can't, though it'd be a hell of a sight." His words dripped contempt, but the unease spread quick as frost. For all their noise, none of the settlers stepped closer. Something in the Apache's silence weighed heavier than their courage. Eliza's breath came shallow, mist curling against the rope. She did not know what the child had begged, did not hear clearly above the storm, yet she felt it. The shift. The way the laughter dimmed, the way the lantern flames bent toward a single figure. And her heart, battered though it was, sparked faintly with something perilously near to hope. The snow thickened then, blotting out edges of buildings, cloaking the jeers in muffled echoes. Lydia still stood before the giant, her small shoulders squared in desperate courage. The men muttered, restless, unwilling to test silence made heavier by storm. Chaska moved at last, one slow step forward, the snow whispering around his bare feet. No word left his mouth. Yet his eyes, dark and unyielding, locked upon Eliza, and in them she saw no mockery, no judgment, only an unreadable depth that made her pulse stumble. She had been stripped of all she could cling to, left bare before her tormentors. Yet in the eyes of this silent stranger, she was not broken. Lydia turned back to her mother, her face alight with a fragile joy. "He'll help us, Mama," she cried, voice high with certainty. "He'll help us now." Eliza's tears froze on her cheeks. The rope at her wrists burned deeper as she tried to straighten against the post. She did not know if the child's faith was folly. She only knew that the storm had shifted, and with it, the rhythm of her own heart. And as the settlers shuffled back into their laughter, as Sheriff Amos spat into the snow and muttered about savages meddling, one truth hung heavier than the storm itself: the eyes of the Apache had not left her, and the world would never be the same again. The snow had muffled most things, but it could not muffle the sound of rope being cut clean by steel. One moment Eliza was bound to the post, her wrists burning against the coarse hemp, her knees weak beneath her weight. The next, she felt herself lifted as though she weighed nothing at all. Her eyes fluttered open through the blur of snow and humiliation. The giant's arms were beneath her, scarred and warm even in the storm, and the jeers of settlers faded behind the howl of wind. Lydia stumbled after them, clutching her doll, her feet sinking in the drifts. "Mama!" she cried, but her voice held no terror now. It rang with wonder, as though the world itself had tilted. Chaska said nothing. Not when he carried Eliza past the circle of lantern light. Not when men muttered, half-drunk and unsure whether to stop him. Not even when Sheriff Amos barked, "You'll regret this, Apache." He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never asked permission. Snow clung to his long hair and chest, but his stride did not falter. Eliza lay still in his arms, ashamed of her limpness, yet powerless to protest. She had been carried once before, by her husband, dying from fever on the trail. That memory bled into this one, until she could no longer tell whether her tears were for the past or for the strange salvation she now found herself in. Her shorn hair itched against her temples, and she turned her face into his chest to hide. The storm closed around them, wrapping the three of them in white silence. Lydia's small figure trudged beside them, her little breaths puffing clouds. She reached out now and then, brushing her mother's skirt as though to assure herself that they would not be separated again. At the edge of town, the last lantern disappeared behind them. Only then did Chaska pause, setting Eliza gently on her feet. She swayed, unsteady, the rope burns throbbing on her wrists. He drew a knife again, not toward her but toward the bindings still clinging to her skin. The blade kissed the rope, and it fell away. For the first time, she looked directly into his eyes. They were darker than the storm, steady and unreadable. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to plead, to protest, but her tongue clung to her teeth like ice. Lydia filled the silence, rushing forward to seize her mother's hand. "I told you, Mama," she said breathlessly. "He'll help us. He will." The words pierced Eliza more than any jeer had. Her child's faith was unbearable in its purity. She feared it would shatter under the weight of the world. Yet when she glanced back to the man towering before them, she could not deny the strange gravity that steadied her own heart. Chaska gestured with one hand toward the white wilderness beyond, then began walking again. There was no question in the movement, no chance for refusal. He expected them to follow, and after one brief glance at Lydia's determined little face, Eliza did. The path wound upward into the pines, where snow lay deep and unbroken. The storm dulled the world into silence save for the crunch of their steps. Eliza's skirts clung wet to her ankles, and her body trembled with cold, but the heat of shame burned stronger than the winter. She could feel the town's laughter still echoing inside her chest, as if it would never leave. Each step felt like a choice: follow into the unknown or return to a place where dignity had been stripped away. When they reached a clearing, a small cabin revealed itself, its roof bowed under the weight of snow, smoke whispering from the chimney. The sight of warmth made Eliza's knees weaken anew. Chaska pushed the door open without effort and stood aside. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke and pine resin. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting an amber glow over furs spread across the floor. The place smelled of leather, cedar, and ash. Lydia darted in first, clutching her doll as though she were claiming a kingdom. Eliza lingered at the threshold, half frozen. To cross inside felt dangerous in a way she could not name. Yet Chaska's gaze moved over her once, calm, unpressing, and something within her yielded. She stepped across the threshold. The door closed, shutting out the storm. For the first time in weeks, silence did not mean shame. It meant safety. Eliza lowered herself onto a bench near the fire, her body still rigid, her hands twisting in her lap. The heat of the flames bit her skin until it ached. Chaska moved with economy, feeding logs to the fire. He placed a carved wooden comb on the table beside her, its smooth handle gleaming faintly in the firelight. The gesture stole her breath. It was not mockery, not pity. It was as if he had looked into her shame and answered with a gift of restoration. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, tracing the carved grooves. She remembered the laughter, the tearing of her hair, the weight of humiliation. And yet here in this cabin, a single object laid before her felt like a seed of dignity returned. She could not speak her thanks, but her eyes stung with tears that spoke for her. Lydia curled close on a fur, her doll pressed against her chest. Her eyes fluttered shut, heavy with sleep and trust. The storm beat on the roof, but within these walls its fury was muted. Eliza pulled the hide tighter around her child, then glanced again at the man who had given them this shelter. Chaska sat opposite, silent as stone, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. His silence was not cruel but watchful, as though words were too small for the weight of the night. The fire carved shadows across his face, catching the deep scars that crossed his shoulder and arm. Eliza wondered what battles had written themselves upon his skin. She also wondered what claim he believed he now had upon her. No man gave without expecting something in return. Yet when his eyes lifted briefly to hers, there was no hunger in them, no demand. Only something solemn, something that unsettled her more than lust would have. She lowered her gaze, cheeks hot. In her lap, her fingers wove unconsciously through the air where her hair used to fall. She touched the ragged ends at her nape and flinched. She would never be whole again. The night deepened, and exhaustion claimed her. She lay beside Lydia, pulling the child close, though her eyes stayed fixed on the fire. Every crackle seemed to echo the heartbeat of the man across from her. She told herself she would rise at dawn and leave, that she would not impose. Yet even as she thought it, her body sank into the furs as though it had found home. Snow pressed harder against the walls, rattling the window panes. The world outside was white fury, but within the cabin, warmth gathered. Eliza's eyes closed at last, her breath evening out. Lydia's hand rested atop hers, small and certain. Chaska sat awake still, his gaze steady upon the mother and child curled by his fire. The storm might have raged forever, yet his silence was deeper still. When Eliza stirred once more in half-dream, she thought she heard a sound, a voice low and rough as stone shifting in a river. She could not be certain whether it was the wind or him, but the single word seemed to linger in the flames. Mine. Her eyes flew open, but the cabin was quiet again, the man's profile unreadable against the firelight. She drew Lydia closer, her heart pounding with something she dared not name. And in that silence, heavy with both fear and fragile hope, she realized their lives had already crossed beyond undoing. The snow thinned as days passed, but the whispers did not. They curled through town like smoke, slipping under doors and clinging to rafters. Every man, woman, and child seemed to hold the story in their mouths. Eliza Mayfield, shorn and carried away by the Apache. It spread with the speed of fire across dry grass, needing no truth to make it burn. On Sunday morning, the church bell tolled, and the pews filled with townsfolk wrapped in wool and suspicion. Eliza entered only in their words, though her presence lingered like a ghost between the hymns. Martha Greeley's tongue was sharpest, her whispers carrying farther than the preacher's sermon. "Cut hair, tied to a post like some sinner," she told the woman beside her, eyes narrowed. "And then begging a savage to carry her off. Mark me, she'll cling to him now, because no decent man will touch her." The women nodded, adjusting shawls tighter around their shoulders, as though shame could be contagious. Behind them, men muttered their agreement, voices low but cutting. Some spat the words, "ruined woman." Others laughed that she had been married off by her own child. The cruelty was never spoken to Eliza's face, but it grew roots deeper than any snowdrift. In the cabin high among the pines, Eliza felt it even without hearing. She sensed the weight of their judgment in the way the air stiffened whenever she walked to town for supplies, Lydia clinging to her skirt. Men's eyes slid over her, not with hunger but with ridicule. Women turned shoulders deliberately, whispers muffled but not enough. She kept her gaze on the ground, clutching her basket, praying each step would carry her out of sight. Chaska walked beside her once, his shadow vast against the street, and the mutters grew harsher. Sheriff Amos stepped from his porch, spitting tobacco into the snow. "You're making a fool of yourself, woman," he told her flatly, though his gaze flicked to Chaska with a challenge he dared not press further. "This ain't no place for shame parading itself. Best you go back where you belong." Eliza lowered her head, shame rising hot in her chest, but before she could speak, Chaska's hand brushed lightly against hers. Just the barest graze of calloused fingers. The touch steadied her more than words could. She drew Lydia close and walked on, though her heart beat hard as a drum. At the Mercantile, Jed Carter waited. The man who had cut her hair still bore the smirk of a boy proud of cruelty. "Well, if it ain't the Apache's prize," he drawled loud enough for the whole shop to hear. He reached for the shawl at her shoulders, tugging the fabric loose. "Wonder if he likes you better with no hair to grab." The words landed like stones. Eliza froze, shame flooding her body, but she did not cry out. It was Lydia who reacted first, her small fist striking Jed's arm, her high voice breaking the silence. "Leave her be." Jed laughed, shoving the child lightly aside. "Ain't no loss as I can't speak truth." Before his hand could reach again, a shadow fell across him. Chaska stood close enough that Jed's breath caught. The Apache did not raise a fist, nor did he speak, but his eyes bored into the man with such stillness that Jed stumbled back, his grin faltering. The shopkeeper cleared his throat loudly, pretending to arrange sacks of flour. Jed muttered something about savages and their strays, and slunk out into the snow. Eliza's knees trembled, not from fear but from the weight of being defended without a blow struck. She turned her face toward Chaska, her lips parting to thank him, but his eyes were already elsewhere, steady and distant. He did not need her gratitude. The gesture had been for something deeper than pride. That night in the cabin, she sat by lamplight, mending the shirt he had worn thin at the shoulders. Her hands trembled as she stitched, the lamplight haloing the fabric. He sat across the room, sharpening tools, silent as always. When at last she rose to hand him the mended garment, their fingers brushed, lingering a heartbeat longer than needed. She looked up then, caught in the fire's glow, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a vow, not even a promise, but the fragile seed of belonging. Lydia, half asleep beside the fire, held up a scrap of paper she had scrawled upon with charcoal. A crude drawing of 3 figures, a tall man, a woman with short hair, and a child in between, all holding hands. "It's us," she murmured proudly before sleep claimed her. Eliza's throat closed with tears. She tucked the drawing close, as though it were the most precious thing she had ever held. But the world outside did not rest. Gossip sharpened into plotting. Jed Carter's pride had been wounded before others, and such men never rest easy when humiliated. In the saloon, over whiskey, he riled companions with talk of taking back what belongs to decent folk. Laughter rang, but beneath it ran the bitter edge of envy and rage. The winter pressed on, snow heavy upon roofs, the air thick with suspicion. Eliza moved carefully, wary of every whisper, yet within the cabin she began to breathe differently. She sang softly to Lydia by the fire, hummed old hymns she had forgotten. She even found herself laughing once, quietly, when Chaska returned with a rabbit snared in the snow and dropped it at her feet without ceremony. The laugh startled her, but it did not feel foreign. It felt like something remembered. Still, shame lingered like a shadow. At night, she touched her shorn hair and wept silently, fearing she could never be whole. Yet each dawn, when she found the comb on the table, laid where he had left it, she felt steadied. She had been broken before men, but in his silence, something was being pieced back together. Then came the day she walked to the creek for water, the sky pale with late winter sun. As she bent to fill her bucket, she heard voices in the trees, low, harsh, plotting. "We'll drive him off," one said. "She'll see where she belongs. No woman stays with a savage if she's given no choice." Her breath caught. She pressed Lydia close, retreating up the bank with her skirts wet. Her heart hammered with fear, yet beneath it ran something fiercer than fear, a pulse of resolve. She would not be dragged again before jeering crowds. She would not be cut down twice. That night, she sat by the fire, staring into the flames as though they could tell her the future. Lydia slept against her lap, the charcoal drawing still clutched in her small hand. Chaska's shadow shifted across the walls as he tended his blade. She wanted to tell him what she had heard, but the words clung to her throat. To speak them aloud would make them real. Instead, she looked up, catching his gaze at last. The firelight turned his scars to bronze, his eyes dark and steady. She felt her voice rise, faint but unbroken. "They mean to come," she whispered. His gaze did not flicker. He only set the blade down, the sound of steel on wood echoing in the silence. And in that silence, Eliza realized what it meant. The storm had only just begun, and the world outside would soon test whatever fragile life they had begun to build. The storm returned with teeth, sealing the cabin in white silence. Days blurred, one into the other, the world outside buried in snow so deep that paths vanished and the pines bent under the weight. Eliza had never known such stillness, nor such confinement. Yet within those walls, something fragile began to take root, shaped by necessity and the quiet rhythms of life. Chaska rose early, moving with the discipline of a man who did not bend to weather. He returned with wood stacked high, snow dripping from his hair, the cold clinging to his bare skin. Eliza watched him from the hearth, her needle in hand, and for the first time, she did not look away. He set down the wood without ceremony, then crouched by the fire, feeding the flames until they roared. The glow caught in his eyes, and she felt her breath catch as if the storm outside had shifted inside her. Lydia adored him without hesitation. She followed him into the snow when the winds calmed enough, her small boots pressing prints alongside his giant strides. He bent low to show her rabbit tracks, his finger drawing circles in the snow. She squealed with delight, her laughter carrying through the cold, and when she brought back the rabbit he had trapped, she laid it in her mother's lap with pride. "He teaches me," she said, her cheeks flushed. "He teaches me everything." Eliza cooked what little he brought, rabbit stews, thin broth flavored with herbs she gathered by memory from the trail. Each time she set a bowl before him, her hands trembled, fearing he might scorn her offering. Yet he accepted with the same steady silence, eating until the bowl was empty, setting it down with a nod that meant more than praise. Slowly, she learned to see his quiet as a kind of language, each gesture a word unspoken. At night, Lydia curled against her mother, dreaming softly, while Eliza sat in the glow of fire and shadows. Sometimes Chaska sat across from her, sharpening blades or carving wood, his presence filling the room as completely as the storm. Other times he moved about the cabin with a rhythm of routine, placing furs to dry, mending his gear. She began to see that his silence was not emptiness but strength, a steadiness she had never known from any man. And in that stillness, she began to change. Shame still pressed heavy, yet she found herself humming softly to Lydia, melodies from her childhood she thought she had lost. She found herself laughing once, quietly, when Chaska stumbled against the low beam and muttered something in his own tongue that needed no translation. The sound startled her, fragile and bright, and though she covered her mouth, he looked at her then with something like warmth behind his eyes. One evening, as the storm screamed against the walls, she sat near the fire mending his coat. Her hair, jagged and uneven, fell forward as she bent low. Chaska's shadow loomed over her suddenly, and she startled, nearly dropping the garment. He crouched low, lifting a strand of her shorn hair between his fingers. His touch was careful, reverent even. She froze, heat rushing to her cheeks. But he did not mock, nor pity. He simply tucked the strand gently behind her ear, and returned to his place. That single gesture undid her more than any word could. Later, when she believed him asleep, she whispered into the dark. "I thought I was ruined," she said, voice trembling. "But you see me still." The words floated like ash into silence. She did not know if he heard, but she felt lighter for having said them. The days dragged, snow sealing them tighter, but within the cabin the distance between them narrowed. Lydia often climbed into Chaska's lap with no fear, chattering about the dolls she made from scraps of cloth. He listened, patient, his great hands holding the fragile toys as if they were glass. Eliza watched, her heart aching with a strange tenderness she had not felt since before her husband's death. Yet even as warmth grew within, fear thickened outside. Each time Eliza braved the path to town, she felt the eyes, the whispers that followed her steps. "Savage as woman," they hissed. She begged him to take her. She carried the shame home like stones in her basket. One afternoon, she lingered too long near the mercantile, and she heard them again, Jed Carter and his companions, their voices thick with whiskey. "When the snow clears, we'll go up," Jed said. "Drive him off. She'll crawl back. No woman would choose that life." Eliza's blood ran cold. She hurried home, clutching Lydia close, but the words echoed inside her long after. That night, she sat silent by the fire, staring into the flames, her hands shaking as she mended Lydia's shawl. Chaska glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he knew the weight of what she carried, but would not force it from her lips. She finally spoke near midnight, when Lydia slept. "They mean to come," she whispered. "They mean to take me back." He did not answer. He set aside the blade he had been sharpening, the sound of steel on stone ceasing. His gaze met hers, steady, unflinching, and in that silence she felt the depth of his resolve. He would not let them. She knew it as surely as she knew the storm would rage again. The next morning, the sun broke briefly through the clouds, spilling gold across the snow. Eliza stepped outside, her breath curling in the cold. For the first time, she lifted her head rather than keeping her gaze low. Lydia laughed beside her, her little boots crunching through the frost. Chaska stood by the doorway, arms folded, watching with eyes that seemed to carry both pride and warning. It was in that golden light that Eliza felt the first stirrings of dignity. She was no longer only the shorn woman mocked in town. She was a mother whose child laughed freely again, a woman who could stand in the snow and not bow her head. But as the day faded, smoke rose from the distant town, and with it the sound of voices carried faint through the wind. Torches flared in the twilight, moving slowly toward the pines. The settlers had gathered, their shadows stretching long against the snow. Inside the cabin, Lydia slept, her small hand curled around her drawing of 3 figures holding hands. Eliza held her close, her own breath shallow. Chaska stood at the window, the firelight burning across his scars, his eyes fixed on the glow of torches approaching through the storm. The walls seemed to breathe with the weight of what was coming. Eliza's heart pounded, her hands clutched Lydia tighter, and the world shrank to the cabin, the fire, and the steady figure at the window. And in that moment, she understood. The storm outside had only been a prelude. The true test was marching toward them, torches in hand. The torches came first, bright flowers of fire swaying against the black sweep of night. Their glow flickered on trunks of pine, on the white folds of snow, on the restless shapes of men advancing through the storm. Eliza held Lydia tight against her chest, the child's small heart beating so fast she could feel it through the wool. From the window, the world looked both distant and terrifying, like a dream that had hardened into reality. Chaska stood unmoving at the door, his silhouette stark in the firelight, each scar on his back catching the glow as though carved from bronze. He did not arm himself with more than an axe already near the hearth, yet his presence filled the cabin larger than any weapon could. Eliza felt fear curl through her belly, but beneath it ran something sharper, an ache not to break again before the eyes of men who had delighted in her shame. The voices drew nearer, the storm carrying them in broken fragments. Jed Carter's laugh rose above the rest, harsh and triumphant. There it is. His den. Take the woman back, let the savage rot with his own kind. The words made Eliza flinch, but she lifted her head at last. She would not cower. Not again. Chaska opened the door. The wind surged inside, snowflakes scattering like sparks across the floor. The settlers drew back instinctively, taken aback by the sight of him shirtless in the storm, broad chest bare to the cold, scars gleaming in firelight. He stepped out slowly, the axe in one hand, his hair streaming wild in the wind. He did not speak, yet the storm itself seemed to hush. The crowd wavered. Some shifted uneasily, torches trembling. But Jed pushed forward, sneer wide, anger bright. "She belongs to us," he shouted, pointing toward Eliza framed in the doorway. "She was marked. No woman of this town takes shelter with you." Eliza's pulse thundered. She felt every eye burn against her skin. The memory of rope cutting her wrists flared again, the laughter, the clumps of hair in the snow. For one breath she nearly crumbled beneath it. Then Lydia slipped from her arms and stepped forward, her little boots sinking in the drifts. She faced the crowd with tears frozen on her cheeks, her voice breaking yet fierce. "Please marry her," she cried. "Please marry my mama." The torches crackled. The words fell heavy as stone, and silence spread. No one laughed this time. The storm itself carried the plea into every ear. Eliza's throat closed with tears, yet she stepped forward too, out into the snow, her shorn head lifted. Her shawl whipped in the wind, but she faced them all. "I choose to stay," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "I was shamed, mocked, tied like an animal. But I choose to stay with him. Not one of you owns me." The crowd rippled with unease. Even Sheriff Amos, his jaw clenched, looked away from her gaze. Only Jed's fury sharpened. He lunged forward, hand outstretched as if to drag her away again. Before he could touch her, Chaska's arm shot out. He caught Jed's wrist in one great hand, the axe glinting in the other. Chaska spoke then, his voice low, rough, yet carrying above the storm. "She is mine. Not by chains. By choice." Jed's face blanched, rage draining to fear. Chaska released him with a shove that sent him sprawling into the snow. The settlers stepped back, torches wavering, their courage breaking beneath the weight of his words. None dared move closer. Eliza stood between them, Lydia clutching her skirt. Her heart pounded so loud she thought it might crack her ribs, but she did not falter. She reached down, took Lydia's hand, and then, slowly, trembling, placed her other hand in Chaska's. The crowd saw it. A woman marked by shame holding her head high, a child's plea made flesh, a man silent until now claiming them both. The settlers broke then, muttering, their torches shrinking into the distance as the storm swallowed them. Jed staggered last, cursing, but even he turned away. Soon only snow remained, falling soft and unrelenting, burying footprints as though none of it had ever been. Inside, the cabin glowed again with firelight. Eliza sat trembling, Lydia curled in her lap, the storm's roar fading beyond the walls. Chaska stood over them, the axe set aside, his breathing slow. At last, he knelt before Eliza, his great hand reaching for the length of rope still coiled near the hearth, the same rope that had bound her wrists. He laid it across her palms, then placed his hand over hers, closing it gently. The gesture said more than vows could. What had once bound her in shame now tied her to him in choice. Tears blurred her vision. She whispered, voice breaking, "Then I am yours." Lydia's small laugh broke the heaviness, pure as bells. She clutched both their hands together, as though sealing what had already been written by the storm. Outside, the night closed again over the town's cruelty, over torches snuffed and laughter silenced. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the three of them sat bound by something stronger than rope, stronger even than shame. And years later, the story would still be told by those who had watched in silence that night. How a shorn woman stood unbroken, how a child's plea carried louder than men's jeers, and how an Apache spoke one word that turned mockery to silence. The old soul telling it leans toward you now, whispering as the flames crackle low. In the storm, Dignity was not granted by a town, nor stolen by cruelty. It was chosen, claimed and guarded. And so it is for you too. No shame placed upon you can hold if you lift your head and stand where love has seen you. Remember that when the world tries to bind you. Remember Eliza, who rose in snow.